What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the BREWtally Speaking Podcast, the official podcast of MetalNexus.net, where you can get all your show reviews, concert reviews, and so much more. And with me, as always, is Daniel Terry. How are you doing this evening?
I am doing fantastic. I am recovering from the disappointment that was my Howard Jones interview.
Yeah, well, we'll just save that for when we actually do the Howard Jones interview, but suffice it to say, we did a Howard Jones interview and had a lot of technical difficulties to overcome, and Dan got to ask one question, and
worth it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes this is what we just have to deal with when dealing with technology, and but, you know, speaking of technology, we actually have Eric Guenther, the keyboardist of the Contortionist. They have a new EP getting ready to come out through E1/Good Fight Music called No One. We have had the pleasure of having it for the last, what have we had it for, about a month and a half now at this point?
We've had it for a little while.
And, I mean, for a 4-song EP, like, that's quite a long time to have something and just kind of really sit in it. And, you know, admittedly, I will say that, you know, I'm not the biggest Contortionist fan, but I know you are. And you guys did a really interesting chat about them on Discography Discussion and what the band has meant to you in your mental health recovery and so forth. So it was definitely one that I kind of wanted to talk to them about, you know, a lot of different things. This EP is I think, a kind of a shift even from what they've been doing. So that was kind of another thing that was fun to talk about.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift, but I mean that's kind of the Contortionist for you. None of their albums sound like any of their others.
No,
you know, they start off with kind of more of a deathcore vibe, which, you know, we talked about on the Ken Sushi episode. Ken Suzy, not Ken Sushi. And you know, he had talked about, you know, kind of beefing it up and making it heavier, and that was really apparent because whenever you got to their second release, they had kind of dropped that, you know, deathcore influence and had gone more in their like spacey rock metal direction, and then on Language it was even more so. Like they've always shifted styles pretty consistently through all their releases. So I would say that the EP being more of a shift again was not a surprise. But it is kind of fun hearing them play a cover song because they never really have done that on a record.
Well, it was fun to ask, and especially, you know, they're on tour right now at BT BAM, Between the Buried and Me, for anyone who may not know what that acronym is. And, you know, they obviously put out a pretty seminal covers record, you know, that's, as Eric even talks about, just covers so many genres that you really get a truer sense of who Between the Buried and Me are and what made them who they are and made them so unique and makes them so unique as musicians and as people and as an entity. And the fact that, you know, something that we've been told quite a bit in doing these conversations is that, you know, hey, here's the thing. Bands always do a cover song or whatever when they're recording an album. I think Josh Todd said that, like, it's a little-known secret, even though I think it's a pretty well-known secret. Like, Deftones are notorious for covers, but they always do them in their recording sessions, and they usually end up on a deluxe edition or whatever of said album. But it's one of those things where...
A lot of the time, it's like a studio warm-up for the bands.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, oh, we have this thing, we know how to do this. Like, oh, fuck it, let's just record on it. But it's a thing where 1979, I thought, was kind of an interesting cover, more in the sense of, like, like with the EP title and there being the line in there that I was like, oh, I wonder if they picked it because of that or if that's where the EP name came from, and we didn't necessarily get an answer to that. But I think the fact that when you really sit with this 4-song EP, like, I think 1979, the way they did it, because it's a pretty straightforward arrangement of the song, it's not like drastically different, but I do think that it allows you to start going back into the beginning of the EP and create this, like, continuity of a cycle between start to finish.
Yeah, I agree. It was definitely a strange choice, I thought, at first. But just seeing the way that it tied in, kind of, I actually appreciated that it was a more straightforward cover because that's one of my favorite songs. So I don't necessarily want to hear it done differently. I have no problem hearing it done. It kind of reminds me of like when Weezer put out their Teal album recently.
Solid record.
Yeah, it was, and it was just because they played all the songs straight, like, you know.
But I don't think people realize how hard that is, though, either.
Well, yeah, it's hard for Weezer not to just drop into sounding like busting out the harmonica and going, you know, full Weezer, you know.
Well, I don't even necessarily mean that. I mean, like, the fact of how hard it is to make especially on a record, to make everything sound exactly the same as the version that you're covering. I don't think people realize how hard it is to like get tones dialed in that specifically.
Yeah, it's really hard, and it's especially whenever you're doing a lot of covers. I don't know, man. Like having to lock in a different tone. Obviously, to go from playing Scrubs to playing Paranoid by Black Sabbath just doesn't. And then going into something like Billie Jean. Like that's just masterful. How they did it. And I know this episode's not about Weezer, but it's the only thing it was the only thing I was really thinking about whenever I heard that 1979 cover. And I definitely think that they did it justice, and they didn't make it weird, because I'm always worried because like I consider the Contortionist a pretty weird band. and not as a bad thing, but just that like, how are they going to weird this up? Are they going to like slow it down to like 1/4 of the speed and like it just be like this chill out track, or are they going to go back to their heavier roots and try to beef it up, which I think would be horrible to do with that song. So I think out of the material, I actually found, to be perfectly honest, I found it to be the most surprising aspect of the record, or the EP rather.
But yeah, and it was also kind of fun getting into a little bit of the whole, since we've been just hammering the whole EPs versus full length thing, it has been kind of fun getting someone else's perspective on it, especially, the Contortionist, I think, is more known for albums. So the idea of doing an EP seems a little bit foreign, I think, to their fan base. Maybe I'm wrong with that.
I know, I was like, why is this not 58 minutes long? I didn't really think that. I actually kind of enjoyed that it was more of a bite-sized kind of deal. Because I'm still kind of listening to Clairvoyant and trying to enjoy that one more. And so that album didn't come out that long ago. So it takes a couple of years to digest a Contortionist album or a BT Bam album, or something like, or a Periphery album. Like it takes a minute to get through all that. And it's especially hard for me to sit down with an album more than just once or twice. Unfortunately, because I've got such a ridiculous listening schedule every week now, where it's like I'm listening to one or two bands' whole discographies. I'm listening to the interviews that John did that I wasn't able to do, and I'm also trying to listen to like just random stuff that I enjoy, but like not having time for it. So it can take me, when I'm a huge fan of a band, it can take me a really long time to absorb a record and like really get it. And half the time I'm so behind the times that like, they're like, oh, we got this new one coming out already. And I'm like, okay, that's an exact quote.
Without getting stuck behind the times, let's get into my conversation with Eric of The Contortionist, and we will talk to you all afterward. So I had the pleasure this early afternoon of talking to Eric Guenther, keyboardist for The Contortionist, whose new EP, Our Bones, is out August 9th via E1. How are you doing this afternoon?
Doing great, man. How about you?
Doing good. You guys recently had stopped through here in Grand Rapids about a week and a half ago, I believe it was at this point.
Yeah. Kind of flies by, actually. But yeah, it was about a week ago.
Yeah. So something we're kind of sticklers for on this podcast is talking about, just the musical climate that the industry is in, and whether fans really are wanting EPs or full lengths or singles and so forth. So obviously with this EP you're putting out, what went into deciding to go this route versus just, putting out a full length?
That's actually a really good question, because it's something that, we try and, we have to engage with and strategize sort of how we want to reveal and create our story, I guess, as far as like new music we want to put out and new styles that we want to sort of weave into the band. And doing something like an EP is kind of like it's a little bit more of a test to ourselves in a way, to see like what we're capable of, because I think every recording process is a little bit different. And when we're trying new things, a lot of times we go in with a goal and go in with a certain perception of what's going to happen. And then, things happen differently. And I think it's a great way when you're doing a short release like that. I think it kind of frees up some of your creativity, and there's a little bit less of that sort of creative burden of creating this long-winded sort of conceptual masterpiece idea. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think in the current climate of the music industry, releasing singles and shorter releases like that has kind of become a more common thing because the album format, for whatever reason, it's kind of dying in a way. Is kind of the general perception, which is in my mind is a shame because I grew up listening to records and I still enjoy listening to records from start to finish. But these days it seems more effective to sort of put out short bits of ideas, and you can kind of get faster feedback that way and learn more about, I guess, where you want to go next with your sound or something like that.
Well, like I said, it's something we've kind of been sticklers for on the podcast, and we've gotten a very interesting array of feedback. In talking to Brandon from Atreyu, he was like, because he has a couple of other bands, and one of those projects is more of a sync-based band, or project, I should say. And so at that point, he's very much like, and since it's not on a major label or anything, like he's like, if I get a wild hair up my ass to be like, yo, let's fucking just put this out and go, we can. And he goes, and I kind of like that because it's constantly keeping people on their toes, and it allows us to explore different sonic textures and so forth because we're able to do whatever we want, and it's not indicative of how a whole album is going to be. It's like, no, this is just the one song, or maybe this is two songs that we felt more proud of currently in the moment. But then there's been other people we've talked to, I guess let me finish the Brandon thing because that's where I was going to go. But, he had kind of said, even being in a big major label system, something he would rather do is, since that's kind of single-based and EP-based is kind of how the music industry seems to be shifting as far as from the consumer perspective, is to actually do the same amount of work you would for a full length, but just chop it into a half or a third and then just release it over the same amount of time as you would spend on a normal album cycle. But it keeps people more interested for a longer period of time because the time that people seem to give a shit about a band is when they're putting out something new. That's when all the socials kind of get the most engagement. That's when you get the most press. So at that point, he's like, kind of feeding into what the industry is kind of giving you at this point. That seems to make the most sense. But then you're kind of even getting other people who have kind of said, like, I think it kind of allows the artist to, like other bands used to do an EP in between records, and that also kind of would satiate fans until the next thing. But also maybe if there was the extra new song on there that was kind of hinting toward a newer direction on where the new material was going, it kind of wasn't such a drastic change for the fan to be like, where the fuck did this come from? Because you kind of had that middle ground, that like 0.5, out of the middle ground, like I said, of where to go. And I think there's a lot of interesting ways that this can go, but it's kind of interesting kind of looking at it from your perspective of like, okay, how do we navigate this? And then kind of to actually ask a question out of this, is it actually harder to think, okay, we're going to write and we're only going to do a 3 to 4 song EP? Is it harder to kind of really get a tight 3 or 4 ideas to go? Or do you still approach it like you normally would a record where you're like, okay, we're going to just kind of write, we might have 10 ideas and we're going to pick the best couple out of that?
It's kind of difficult to say. I would to your earlier point. I think all those perspectives make a lot of sense to me and to the way we've approached things. You mentioned how lots of bands like to put out an EP in between records, and we've sort of tried to do that. I think one way that we like to look at it is sort of like a narrative, like the story of the band kind of thing, and how our sound can go from point A to point B while we're using that EP in between 2 records to sort of lead our audience into where we want to go next. And so I guess like a lot of times there are, like you said, maybe 10, 11 ideas that get boiled down into 3 or 4 songs, but I guess my point is a lot of times those decisions on what we want to do with the EP are with the next album in mind, and where we would want to lead our audience's ear, so that, you know, that next LP or whatever the next release is kind of has more context because of you know, maybe an EP or whatever the shorter release is. I don't know.
Just like I said, it was kind of fortuitous that you guys are putting out an EP, and it's something that we very much have been dissecting with everyone we have on. But kind of speaking to that as well, the EP ends. It seems like when you look at the EP and look at the track listing, it seems like an odd choice to end with a cover, let alone of 1979, the Smashing Pumpkins song. But the more I listen to the album, or I should say the EP, over the last week or two, I think it really is a perfect fit as far as a non-original song to accompany these three, because it kind of offers a bit of closure was the best word I could come up with when I kept trying to put my finger on what it was. And there's even, you know, the titular part of the EP name is in that song as well, with Our Bones being in the song. So I kind of was like, there's like a little slight tip of the hat there as well. But how did you land on this song, and were there any others that were in contention to be on this EP?
Yeah, actually, we consistently joke about, there's a running list of songs that we want to cover that just kind of come up from time to time, and we'll goof off with it and play a little bit in rehearsal or something like that. You know, we settled on 1979 just because, well, for one, the Pumpkins are like maybe one of my three favorite bands ever, and even though I love everything they've done, I couldn't say no to like doing one of their most popular songs, because it seems like, in a way, it's not really deep cut at all. You know, it's a very well-known song, but I think we landed on it because it accomplishes a certain vibe, a certain mood, and a certain, you know, space. I like to use a metaphor of like teleportation kind of thing, where like great music is able to sort of remove you from your surroundings and put you in a place. And that song in particular does a great job of that, and we wanted to sort of demonstrate that, because I think it's something our band kind of relies on a lot, is sort of creating a mood and a space with the music that, like I said, removes people from, you know, their actual time and space, you know. So 1979 is a good example of a song that does that. And I think that a lot of our other choices, or our other options for cover songs, would be more direct rock songs and stuff like that. So we went for something that kind of creates a space of its own.
Do you envision, if there's a master list of songs that you would eventually like to get to, do you envision doing something like your tour mates in BT BAM, of doing just a full-on covers record?
We would love to do that, really. And you know, it may happen one day. And if we did that, it would be tough to match the span of what Between the Buried and Me's cover record does, because they cover some amazing music there. We would probably we wouldn't even touch Queen or so. You know, there's just so many, there's so many great hits on that. You know, we would probably try and get a little weirder with it and tune in to, like I said, that kind of vibe thing and music that sucks the listener out into a new space, a new dimension.
You know, something, listening to the band's discography and kind of prepping for this interview, something I kind of noticed is Mike's vocals have kind of changed a little bit over the last two releases, more so counting this EP as one of those two. With him kind of opting more to sing on these last two, does it kind of open you all up musically to kind of create more melodies for him to kind of go off of, if seeming like that's the kind of direction he kind of wants to go into now? Or, you know, I don't necessarily know how your writing style is, so I don't know how involved Mike is, where it's like, hey, we just present him with what we think is great, and then he just sings over it, and then we get to hear the final version. Or if he's actively involved from the starting process, so like he might be like, oh, here's a melody idea, or you might be like, hey, you know what, that's a really cool chorus idea, let me do this thing underneath of it and really bring it out more. I just kind of, in listening to it, I kind of had these questions about your writing process a little bit.
Well, I think one thing that has contributed to what you've noticed, and not only Mike's style changing, but the entire band over the last few recordings, is that we've sort of learned how each other likes to work and what our sort of musical assets are. And so when we are writing, we all kind of write together. It's a very full-on process where, somebody may write a guitar riff, somebody may hum a vocal melody. We all kind of stay pretty active through every step of the process, which is kind of fun, and it's interesting because of how once you notice how things develop and what things started as, eventually, things that are keyboard riffs turn into guitar riffs that turn into vocal melodies, and it just keeps happening like that. So I think part of the stylistic changes are based in developing that process, I guess, and learning how each of us sort of thinks musically and can contribute to the song as a whole. I think in the specific example of like the vocals, it just feels a lot more natural and honest for us to be making the music that we are, and the way things have progressed and will continue to progress, I think, will be based on what feels natural to us and what sounds great.
Yeah, it's kind of, we had Ken Susie on a while back, and he was talking about, the fact that the first record he did with them, with the Contortionist, sounds drastically different than everything else that they've done, but he was like, I think it's because I pushed them to be that style, and maybe they really didn't want to be. So it's kind of interesting, just like I said, kind of looking at everything, kind of hearing Ken's version of like what happened from the first record to now, and then kind of being like, I wonder if it's more of like just a collaborative process between everybody, or if it's, just the age-old thing of like, we just know how to write with each other at this point.
Well, I think it's a journey. There's no solid formula for us, and that process, the writing and recording process, has always been changing. I like to look at our records and our output as a logbook of that, in a way, where you can listen to Clairvoyant and understand, at least from my perspective, which was obviously pretty close to the process and fully involved. I can understand that record and see how our process there was different from Language and Intrinsic, and how it was different from our Bones EP. And I think that process is still changing now. We're learning with every instance, with every recording session. So, like in Exoplanet's case, like that's where the guys were at the time, and I think it's really great to remind ourselves when we're entering a new recording session to be honest with ourselves and allow that process to give each recording its own character.
Absolutely. Kind of speaking to more of, I guess, more of the, I don't even know, so we just had Will Putney on. That was the episode we just dropped, and he was on basically to talk about his STL tonality plugins package thing. And so we kind of looking around at some of your various stuff. I see that you're also offering a preset for like synth patches and so forth, and kind of wanted to know, because it seems like everyone kind of is now doing these things. Has it been interesting to kind of see that there's now a demand for these things, and having them kind of be an ancillary source of income for musicians?
Yeah, actually, I started selling those presets for a couple of reasons. One, people would ask about them, and my pack isn't anything crazy. It's 60 presets spread across 4 different synths that I use the most, and 2 of them are plugins and 2 of them are analog hardware synths. So it's not anything too comprehensive, but I wanted to be able to have something up there that people, producers that were interested could refer to and see what was going on. The other reason was that people would ask for the keyboard stems all the time for Clairvoyant, because when we record, I pretty much produce myself, and it's its own layered, production. And I kind of wanted to have it out there so people could really dig in and see all the layers of what was going on. I definitely think that it's kind of become expected or almost necessary for musicians, if they do have a digital product like that, to put it out there and sort of invite young musicians and people that want to learn more about the process and see under the hood, so to speak. I think it's kind of a sign of the times. We're kind of in a fascinating time for that, because the tools to make a decent sounding recording, are just right in front of you. You could download a few things off the internet and have great guitar tone, great synth tones, great drum tones, and do a whole record in the box in a way that, has never been possible before. So I think that's kind of cool. It gets people more interested in your music too.
Have you had people who have bought these patches and so forth from you kind of have a deeper understanding of what you did on those records, especially, talking about like the clairvoyant stuff, like the stems? Have you had people come up to you and be like, wow, I knew that there was stuff on there, but there was so much more there that I just didn't even know, and it kind of taught me more about like layering or any of that kind of stuff?
Yeah, you hear that all the time, and that's really encouraging. Just to have people that are interested enough to dig in and pay attention and maybe try and learn something or try and gain some new knowledge about our process and arrangement and everything else, because there are very busy recordings. We do have a lot of stuff going on sometimes, so it's kind of I'll go as far to say sometimes it gets a bit messy.
Not at the level of Bohemian Rhapsody, speaking of Queen, with the, what was it? Was there 80 vocal tracks, I think they said at that point, on that one?
Yeah, no. They're definitely early grave. I'm not even going to try and quote the exact number, but there were a huge amount of layers Mike did for, I guess, every song on the EP. 1979 definitely stayed pretty raw. But for Early Grave and Follow, there were just huge layers. Sometimes I'm not even gonna guess, but almost 30 or 40 layers of tracks and stuff, different harmonies and stuff like that. Yeah, so a lot of times we'll lay stuff down just to sort of have a bed, have an array of things to toy with and try different arrangements and different mixing techniques out. But yeah. I mean, we have the ability to do it, so why not? We like really, really thick recordings, I think.
Kind of the last few questions I have for you in wrapping up. I don't think people realize that there are as many keyboardists or samplers and so forth in rock and metal as there really are. So are there any in any of the bands that maybe you tour with or just in general that you kind of look at for like inspirations and just kind of want to put a spotlight on?
Ooh, that's a good question. A lot of times my inspiration lately is, at least as far as keyboard players, has been a lot of jazz musicians, and sometimes producers and stuff like that. Been listening to a lot of retro wave stuff. This guy Contortionist has really great textures. I guess in our genre, you're right, there really aren't a lot, and we really don't tour with a lot of keyboard players. That's a really tough question.
Well, I was going to say, like, kind of looking, I guess it's more like extreme metal, I would say, but like, I was thinking, like, off the top of my head, it's like, and this isn't an extreme metal, but like, Burton from Him is someone that does a lot with more technical piano and synth stuff. You have Marta bleeding through Lindsay over in Cradle of Filth, Sean, when he was in Chimera. There's examples of it throughout, the last couple of decades or so of metal and rock and so forth, but I feel like they're kind of, it's an often overlooked part of the show and part of the band.
Well, I mean, I could go back to one of my original inspirations is simply, Nine Inch Nails is a great example of how, like, how keyboards and that type of production style can be often grittier and heavier than, a typical guitar, bass and drums arrangement of a rock band. So, I mean, to me, Trent Reznor is just sort of the best example. Sean Z did some cool stuff in Chimera. I remember those records having some interesting synth production.
Yeah, kind of a fun last two questions. You recently shared on your Instagram a few months back about, wanting to do a return to From Exile. So I kind of wanted to know, has there been any developments on that front at all?
Well, that's funny you ask, because that was my Atlanta band that I started in college, and I did recordings with a guy named Eyal Levy, who was in this band called Doc, and Sean Z was actually in that band for a little while. Eyal actually introduced me to the Contortionist in 2012, so some of that, I guess what I was doing with From Exile precipitated what I'm doing now. So the guy that engineered the Our Bones EP is a Atlanta-based producer named John Douglas, who's been a longtime friend of mine, and he joined my band years and years ago, and we've been working on a record for almost 6 years now. And it's kind of gotten pushed aside because of all the Contortionist stuff going on for a million different reasons, but we are slowly getting there, and hopefully we'll have something next year. As far as shows and things like that, we haven't had a live band ready for a few years now, but we'll see. It's a bit different than the Contortionist, but and I hesitate to try to describe it, but I think it's definitely still prog rock, prog metal. I think people will get it. It's definitely going to happen.
It just kind of is one of those things in this day and age. It seems like when anyone posts something like that, it's like, oh, like this thing, and you're just kind of like, wait, is this like a pseudo teaser of like, I might be bringing this back, because I've been in that headspace lately writing for new stuff or whatever, so I wasn't sure. It's not to say that it went unnoticed, it just was one of those things that as I was looking at it, I was like, I've seen this too often where like a few months later or maybe a year later, people are like, where the fuck did this record come from? And it's like, this post was basically the breadcrumb trail that I was leaving and letting you know, like, hey, some new shit's on the way.
Yeah, that's kind of the idea. It's always going to be kind of a labor of love, my original band kind of thing. But it exists. It's out there. The record's 80% done. So hopefully next year we'll have something out.
Awesome. And the last question before I have you do the typical plugging of socials and so forth. I noticed in listening to All Gray that there is a very cinematic sense on that song. And it kind of made me wonder if there's any interest in doing like video game or film score or any of that kind of stuff, just scoring in general.
Absolutely. That's actually always been sort of a loose long-term goal to, I guess, pursue the rock and roll thing just because it's happening, and I have a great opportunity with the Contortionist, and I like to look at what I can offer to the band as that sort of theatric element. And I've done a few independent video games, from back in the day, and a few short films that never made it anywhere. So it's always been something I've dabbled in, but haven't yet had the time to totally focus on a demo reel and get it going. So having said that, yes, definitely plan on doing soundtracking and anything I can like that. Pretty much any movie that appeals to me these days, it's sort of based in that, how the soundtrack works for me and how I felt that it applied to the story of the film. So I look forward to one day doing some soundtracking.
Yeah, like I said, just was something that, especially that song, I just kind of, in listening to it in headphones and kind of doing some other work and so forth, I just kind of had this like grandiose sense of like, oh, like you could almost see it like on a script where it's like, shots, external of whatever, blah, blah, blah. And then I'm just like, I wonder, if just that's something that you have in mind when you're doing stuff.
Yeah, it almost feels like the credits could be rolling or something like that, because it's short, succinct, it has a quick idea, but still sets a mood, sets a setting, I guess.
And lastly, what does the rest of this year have for you, and where can people find you or the Contortionist online?
The Contortionist is finishing out this tour between the Bear and me, and then we're going to Europe next month to do a few festivals and some headlining shows. We have some plans cooking for the fall, but nothing I can really announce yet. And well, you can find our stuff at thecontortionist-store.com.
I think that's one of the first websites I've heard of with a hyphen in it.
Yeah. I think it changed recently.
And then lastly, where can people find you and the band online?
Thecontortionist-store.com. You can pre-order the EP there.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time, and safe travels out on the rest of this this tour, and hopefully we'll see you back around Midwest at some point before the year ends.
All right, man. Yeah, thank you.
So that was my conversation with Eric of the Contortionist. Dan obviously couldn't be there, and I know he's been a longer fan of the band than I have, but what'd you think of that, chap?
Yeah, I thought it was cool. I thought it was fun just hearing, his idea of, his reasoning behind, why is every album different? Why have you guys gone and kind of, you didn't specifically say why did you guys go in a softer direction, because that's not really a good question, because soft and heavy are so subjective. There's obviously,
well, I'm sure to a lot of people this is still considered heavy.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. Like, to me, yeah, sure, you go back and compare it to Exoplanet and it sounds like soft rock, but there's still heavy parts in it, like this Baroness chat that we're trying to get off the ground. There's a band that's absolutely heavy that doesn't have screaming vocals. You know what I mean? So, but I liked him just, basically like, this is how we've all discovered that we like working together. This is how we, come up with these ideas and how we just kind of always want to be shifting. Because I think with a lot of bands, the shift is subtle and they don't always even understand necessarily that they've fundamentally changed. And so to hear him switch it up like this on every single release is kind of refreshing and kind of keeps you guessing on what they're going to do next.
Yeah, and I like the fact that he was pretty upfront about how they write. I always find that to be interesting because, like I said in the interview, I don't really think it's been noted how the Contortionist writes material. It's just, hey, here's, a new record. But it is interesting that, when you've been working with someone as long as these guys have, you just kind of know how each other works. And I think in the day and age now where you can, I know Eric also plays guitar and stuff like that. So obviously he probably is proficient enough in writing songs and arranging songs himself and being able to just bring the band maybe a whole song. But it might be one of those things where he realizes that that's not what he needs to do in that band. And so the fact that I think everyone kind of knows how to work and write for the Contortionist, I think is actually really refreshing, as opposed to being like, well, I came in with my idea and, we talk about this all the time with Deftones. It's like, okay, here's Chino coming in being like, oh, I came up with these ideas. And then Steph's like, I'm not feeling it. And then, now we get, Koino, or, we get Gore. And then it's like, afterward, everyone's like, oh, it really wouldn't. I think we really need to have Steph involved in this one again. And it's like, yeah, no shit. Like, it's the only one of the few records that you guys have done that sounds not entirely like a Deftones record because not everyone was involved. And there are ebbs and flows that come from that. I don't want to call it like butting of heads, but just kind of the melding of ideas. I think, Diamond Eyes for Deftones is a great example of, Chino coming with songs now that he plays guitar and all that kind of shit. But I think it's a great example of what happens when you really mix Chino and Steph, and I think White Pony is the other really great example of mixing their two styles together and the rest of the band kind of finding their spots. And I think the Contortionist, from what I listen to of the band, has kind of always done that. I think that they're a really great complementary unit unto themselves.
Yeah, I love the idea of a band as an entity. As an entity that kind of exists, not necessarily outside of the band members themselves, but it being kind of just this machine where every single person in the band is a key component. And, without each individual component, it kind of unravels. Not every band is like that. So it's fun to think of the band as kind of this living, breathing, kind of separate organism, but these guys come together. They all do their jobs, and what you end up with is something that they can all be proud of, instead of it because whether it does well or it doesn't do well, like, as long as they're proud of it and they all did exactly what their roles were, I think that they're always going to be happy with it, and it's not necessarily going to matter whatever the charting success is.
Speaking of all that, though, I was pretty excited to hear that I guess we're getting a new From Exile record, or whatever this new iteration of it is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's exciting. I would like for it to just be under the same moniker, just so, like, because, dude, I cannot keep track of another band name. You know what I mean? Like, because, like, it's one of those, like, I used to just like bands, and then I started becoming fans of the individual people in the bands, and then it's like they've got side projects, and it's all under different names, and it's so confusing, and I'm old, and kids these days, and get off my lawn, but, like, it really, I would like to see it come out, under the same moniker, and we not have to go through and find a new band name, even if it sounds completely different. Like, I don't care.
Kind of speaking to a new name and something that sounded good. I'm currently drinking a Belle's Chocolate Cherry Vanilla Stout. And I was pretty excited about it because a lot of Belle's beer is kind of hit or miss for me. It's very, exactly what I just said. It's hit or miss. But usually their stouts are really good. Their Expedition Stout's really great. Their Kalamazoo Stout's really great. They have some other interesting beers here and there, but typically for me, I'm going to stick to the dark beers. That's usually where they seem to do the best to me. So I was at a local grocery store that has a tap system in the middle of the store, and this is one of them that sounded pretty interesting.
Dude, that sounds amazing. My grocery stores have nothing like that.
It's the only one out of the chain of grocery stores that has that currently. So we're kind of spoiled in that regard, and it's constantly like I think that this last week it was, because it changes like every week or so. Belle, it was like a Belle's tap takeover. I think they have another one coming up, but they have brewmasters and so forth, and distillers and so forth come through, because obviously it's in the middle of the beer, liquor, wine selection. So it was $18, but I didn't have to pay for the growler, so it's like $18 for the growler brand new and the growler filled. So it's like you can't really beat it. To try a new beer, I kind of went all in on it, thinking it would be really good because you can't sample anything, and it's not that it's terrible. I think just when I tried making my own cherry vanilla stout, actually I tried making a cherry vanilla porter. The problem when you're doing anything with cherries is you get this like tart flavor, and it kind of overwhelms everything else, at least from what I've found. And so I think in this, the beer is a little bit more sour than I would have wanted it to be. It almost kind of is more of like the Goza kind of family, if that makes sense, and like the sours themselves. But I've actually been sitting on this for like still sealed for probably about 5 days now, and the sour flavors kind of mellowed out quite a bit. So maybe that's the key. Buy this beer, let it sit for a hot minute, and then take a drink. Unless you're into more sour like stouts, which I'm not personally.
See, I actually kind of enjoy the tart cherry flavor. I like it to just kind of leave an aftertaste, like a sour. But I do enjoy sour beers, so it's not too much of a stretch. But I also, like, a sour beer to me still has to taste like a beer, which I think is hard to do. It's a lot easier just to, like, melt Jolly Ranchers and, make it somehow. And, like, I don't enjoy that stuff. Like, I'm not eating Halloween candy, so. But yeah, I definitely enjoy like the more fruity tart flavors. Like I even had like a tart peach one time, which I thought was really good. But my beer of choice this week has been it's called Scale of Complexity by Four Hands Brewing here in St. Louis, and it's a pale ale with with peach and apricot. I don't want to say flavor. It's more like, I don't know, what do beer people say, like notes
notes and
yeah. So I mean, whatever that means. It's not overpowering in any way, but it's kind of like my continuation and my love of like kind of juicy IPAs, which are bitter but also not really sour. But the hazy, they call it a hazy IPA, which if you drink enough of them, you definitely can get there. But it's really good. And I started with Space Dust, and that kind of got me because that thing is so citrusy. And the Scale of Complexity was cool just because it had kind of more of a fruity flavor, but not just like the straight citrus blast that I'll get from something like Snapper or from Space Dust. And yeah, I'll definitely be checking this one out. Hopefully the price goes down a little bit though. Like, I'm really cheap, so like $10 for 4 cans when I could get 6 cans of Snapper for $8, that sort of thing. It's hard, but I'm glad I took the leap and tried it. And I'm definitely going to be checking out Four Hands. They're really all over the place as far as a brewery goes, because they have this like disgusting like peanut butter. It's like peanut butter and chocolate, which I'm sure, John, you would love, but
yeah,
maybe I'll send you a can sometime. It's okay, but they do all kinds of really weird stuff. They got just like straight milk stout, which I do not like at all. And then they have the chocolate milk stout. And
dude, the best chocolate milk stout that is out, the best chocolate stout that is out there is the Young's brand chocolate stout. So fucking delicious. And if you get their, it's a cherry. I don't think it's a cherry lambic, but if you take the cherry, whatever Young's, or maybe it's Smith's, but I think it's a Young's brand as well. But if you get that and then do a half and half and get like this cherry chocolate stout, like it's, oh my god, it's so fucking good. But those are like, you're looking at, $7 a bottle for those. So I mean, it's like when you do it, like, yeah, you're getting like 2 full glasses out of it for like $14. So I guess it's like brewery prices for something that's so good. But man, if you want to really treat yourself, if you like chocolate dark beers, go find the Young's chocolate stout. You'll just blow your mind.
I'll definitely check it out if I'm in the mood for a chocolate stout. I know I'm going to go see Zayo here in about a week or so, and I told them that I would bring them beer if they came to St. Louis. So I'm going to assume that that's the only reason they're coming to St. Louis. So I've got to really step up my beer game and try to. So I know Scott said that he's more of a stout guy, and the other guys will drink IPAs. Which, I mean, I've got like a whole arsenal of IPAs, that I can show off. But definitely for Scott and a stout, I haven't had a good stout in a long time, so I might just get him like the most ridiculous stout I can think of, which is probably gonna be like the peanut butter chocolate or something like that.
No, speaking of having drinks with band people, this past week, I actually had the privilege of going out with Danny, aka Amigo the Devil, and his lady, and we went to Founders and had some delicious beers, and they ate some food and had some conversations on the patio and so forth, and it was funny. I forget what Danny was actually going to drink at first, but then I got my Port Barrel Hoppenberry beer, which it's the PA Razzle Hoppenberry. It's a 6.6%. It's a blend of the Beer City IPA and Rubaeus Raspberry Ale aged in a port wine barrel. So stupidly delicious. It has a little bit of that, Danny and I were talking because he goes, wait a minute, how did I miss that? I want one of those. So as we both were drinking, he goes, it's really crazy that it does have that back end flavor of like a nice, port wine, which is kind of a little bit more caramely and sweet, kind of more a dessert kind of thing. And, it's one of those that, super good. I think, his lady, Alicia, ended up getting, trying to remember what she ended up getting off the top of my head. I'm looking at their list right now. I think she ended up my wife got the peach cream ale, and that was pretty good. Then Danny ended up getting what the fuck did he get? Then Danny ended up getting this the PR Stunt Cream Ale, which is a 3.8, so I mean nothing super big, but it's a cream ale with a light dry hop of Simcoe and Chinook hops. A real nice easy drink in the summertime. And then I ended up getting the Shark Jump the Cow, which is a milk sugar with a sweet body and creaminess. It's basically an IPA with like dank citrus and tropical notes to it. So basically it's like a juicy IPA, so Dan probably would like it. Maybe not with the milk sugars, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't like sweet drinks. I really don't. It's hard because I just don't. I enjoy bitter flavors so much more, which is why I can't really get into the mixed drinks too much. I mean, every now and again, somebody will make me something that's like makes me want to like start screaming and gagging because it's so bitter and crazy and like a cocktail sort of thing. But that's almost too extreme. I don't know. I'm hard to please.
I think we have a trip to Founders this weekend coming up. So I think the one that's got my eye, I think I've had it before. It's called the 12 Feet Under. It's a burly 14.3%.
Challenge accepted.
It's a twice barrel aged and twice dry hopped barrel aged Imperial IPA, so it'll get you drunk.
Yeah, sounds like in record time.
Oh yeah, and then while we were hanging out with the two of them after the show in their van, they had just been at New Glarus the day before in Wisconsin, and I've never had New Glarus because if you understand anything about them, they are very. We only brew the beer for us, and we know it's super good, but we want you to come to our area. We don't really distribute it. And so they had a bunch of that stuff, and then oh my god, they had this one, it was like some kind of a red something or other. I don't fucking know. It was like nice and sweet and like kind of had the right amount of tart, but it was light and refreshing. And then I don't remember what the other one was off the top of my head either. I mean, because I've been drinking like all day at that point. But Bridget and I were just like, so we're going to Wisconsin in like 2 weeks then, right? To go to this place and try all their magical beers.
I know that if I ever drive up to Grand Rapids, that the first place you and I are going is Founders. And I'd say we just do the podcast live right there, you know? Like,
I mean, there's plenty of places that I have done the podcast at, whether you realize it or not.
Sure.
But kind of been wrapping up just because this ran a little bit longer with the beer talk. But, I mean, we haven't really gone that deep dive on beer as of late, so I think it's justified.
Totally.
If you would like to keep up with The Contortionist, you can find them simply enough at Facebook and Instagram at The Contortionist, Twitter at TCBand, and if you would like to keep up with Eric, you can find him on Instagram at no_I'm_Eric, Guenther, Eric Guenther. And if you would like to keep up with Metal Nexus, you can find them at metalnexus.net, Facebook at Metal Nexus, Instagram at metal.nexus, and Twitter at metal_nexus. And Dan can tell you where he can be found on Draft.
I can be found on Draft here in my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. And you can also find me on Facebook under Daniel Terry. You can find me on Twitter at DiscussMetalDan. You can send me an email at discussmetaldan@gmail.com. And you can find my other podcast, Discography Discussion, at discussmetal.com.
And if you would like to keep up with all things this podcast, you can find us simply enough on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at BrewSpeakPod. Find us on YouTube at BrewSpeakPod or Brewtally Speaking Podcast. You can see some of the in-person interviews we've done. If you would like to email us, you can do such at brewtallyspeaking@gmail.com. Keep up with our show sponsors, The Bean Bastard, at thebeanbastard.com. Facebook and Instagram are The Bean Bastard. And for the Brewtally Speaking Podcast, I am John.
And I'm Dan.
We will talk to you all next time.